First, I want to welcome everyone today and thank you for joining us for today's webinar about outstandingly remarkable values. This is the 5th of 6 webinars in our Wild and Scenic webinar series. And my name is Angie Furman. I'm the River Training Center Coordinator for River Management Society. For those of you that may be unfamiliar, River Management Society is the nation's premier network connecting those who work on rivers and for rivers with their river professional peers. Our members include river managers, outfitters and guides, rangers, planners and landscape architects, fluvial geomorphologists, environmental lawyers and policymakers, students, professors, researchers, and more. If you're not a member, I highly encourage you to visit our website at river-management.org to see all the benefits of being a member, which includes our bi-weekly news digest, the RMS listserv, the quarterly RMS journal, symposium and training discounts, and more. Before we get started today, I'd like to let everyone know that we are recording today's presentation and it will be available in a few days on the RMS video channel. So to get there, you can go to river-management.org, click on professionals and then River Training Center. That'll bring you to the River Training Center page, and then there at the very top, you can click on that image to go to our Training Center video channel. Also in the video description, once it's posted here on our video channel, you're going to find a link to PDF copies of today's slides as well as any handouts. Also, I wanted to point out that today's material tracks with information found in Module 3 of the Wild and Scenic Rivers course of study. This is a free and self-directed learning resource that can be accessed on rivers.gov by going to the Resources tab and then clicking on WSR Training Modules. Rivers.gov is a great website from the Interagency Wild and Scenic Rivers Coordinating Council. Provides a ton of great wild and scenic river resources. And for those who might not know, the overriding goal of the council is to improve interagency coordination in administering the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. They address a broad range of issues from management concerns on rivers presently within the system to potential additions listed in the nationwide rivers inventory. So again, highly encourage everyone to go check out all the great resources available on the site. I'd also like to take a minute and point out that on your little go-to webinar control panel, you'll find there's a little spot for handouts. We might be referring to some of those today, but there's a ton of great links specifically in the handout that's titled Resources and Contact Info. You're also going to find, as it mentions, the contact info for today's presenters. So today we're excited to have 22 of you joining us right now. If you have any questions during today's presentation, please ask them in the Q&A box. My colleague Risa Shimoda is joining me in the background and will be helping field questions. And we'll also be taking breaks throughout the presentation to answer them. And we also have some time set aside at the end to answer them. So before I introduce today's presenters, first, I would like to launch a poll just so we can better understand why you're joining us today. So I'm going to go ahead and launch it right now and give you a few seconds to respond. Give you about 5 more seconds. All right, I'm going to close that poll and then share these results. So it looks like most people are here to refresh their knowledge of ORVs, but we do have some people that are new to the subject, as well as some that have a CRMP but need to update their existing ORV descriptions. So this is helpful for us and the presenters just as we get going today and help answer any questions. So without further ado, I would like to invite today's presenters, Cassie and Monica, to introduce themselves.
Hi, everybody. I'm Cassie Thomas. I'm in Anchorage, Alaska, where I retired 3 years ago from the National Park Service's National Planning Program. And I'm a founding member, or was before I retired, of the Interagency Wild and Scenic Rivers Coordinating Council. And since I've been retired, I've been helping the Fish and Wildlife Service here in Alaska identify ORVs on its 7 rivers that were designated by ANOCA, and consistent with the National Park Service, neither agency really did a very robust job of doing that. So we're finally getting around to doing that. So hi, everybody. Monica.
Hi, I'm Monica Zimmerman, and I'm with the Bureau of Land Management, and I am based out of Idaho Falls, Idaho, and I am a BLM representative on the Interagency Wild and Scenic River Council, and I also helped work with the BLM to develop the different training modules related to wild and scenic rivers, this being one of them that we're going to be presenting today between Cassie and I.
All right, great. Thanks to both of you. And I think I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Cassie to get started.
All right. So hi again, everyone. And I just wanted to add, I forgot to say that I'm also the vice president of the Alaska chapter of RMS. So I know we have some other Alaskans on the meeting today, and I encourage you to join RMS if you aren't already a member. So as we mentioned, or as Angie mentioned when we did the poll, there are a couple of different circumstances under which you would find yourself identifying the outstandingly remarkable values, or ORVs, for a wild and scenic river, either a potential wild and scenic river or one that's already designated. And the process you follow to do that, the criteria, are essentially the same no matter why you are or when you are doing the ORV identification. So if you, in this presentation or in any of the other materials, if you read about eligibility and you wonder because you are doing this for an already designated river, eligibility is just sort of the shorthand for the ORV and free-flowing character elements of deciding whether a river is eligible to be designated. And if it's already been designated, Congress has made that decision, and it's up to us to sort of be consistent with that. So the circumstances under which you would be doing ORV identification could include, as mentioned, a wild and scenic river inventory, also known as a 5D1 inventory. That's from the section of the Act that specifies that federal land manning agencies, whenever they update their general unit plans for their area, and that could be a national forest or a BLM planning unit, they're supposed to do an inventory to see if there are potentially rivers that would qualify for wild and scenic. Historically, having inventories of rivers that are found both eligible and then suitable, which is another step that we're not talking about today, having those rivers identified in one of those plans has sometimes led to some significant congressional action to designate rivers. So it's not just an academic thing. It can be a very vital piece of information to have those rivers kind of on deck for a sympathetic Congress to add them to the national system. The other times we identify ORVs, I know we have some people joining us today who work on partnership rivers in New England mainly, New England and the Northeast. And whenever we have a congressionally mandated river study, which is what led to those partnership designations, we have to report to Congress on the eligibility and suitability of the study rivers. So the ORV identification is done at that point. And it's also done, there's another way for rivers to be designated. basically the governor of a state can petition or apply to the Secretary of Interior to ask her to administratively designate a river. And when a package is nominated by a state, typically the National Park Service is given the job of reviewing it to see if the river that's being nominated is eligible. So again, we'd be looking at ORVs then. And then finally, Park Service tried to do this for all its designated rivers. And as I mentioned, the Fish and Wildlife Service, which mainly has designated rivers here in Alaska, often years after a river is designated, there's a realization that we really don't have a very good handle on what the ORVs are. So we often are updating ORVs much later than the river is designated. So this is a flow chart. I hope you can see it. Yeah, there we go. This is a simplified version of a more complex flow chart we'll be looking at the very end of my section of this presentation. And again, the ORV identification process follows the same steps no matter why and when you're doing it. So the first question is the resource present, or the candidate resource present in the river or its corridor, which is its immediate shorelands. The area varies from 1/4 of a mile to 1/2 a mile, depending on where you are. If the answer is yes, you go on to the next step. If the answer is no, you can stop there. Then, very importantly, is the resource river related or river dependent? And sometimes we use the shorthand of asking, but for the river, would this resource exist? Is it just coincidentally close to the river, or is it really a resource that is associated with the river itself? And if the answer is yes, we keep going. If the answer is no, we want to document why we don't think it's connected. And then we get to the part that asks us, really, is the resource outstandingly remarkable? And the categories we use to define that is the resource needs to either be unique, which is one of a kind, rare, or exemplary within its region of comparison. And so you need to define a region of comparison at that point, and Monica will be telling us a lot more about that later. And deciding whether the resource in question falls into any of these 3 categories. And again, if the answer is yes, that means the resource is an ORV. So you want to document the region of comparison and explain why that resource makes it to ORV status. And then particularly for rivers that are already designated, it can be very important to identify any flows or water quality that are needed in order to sustain these ORVs. And some ORVs aren't really flow or water quality dependent, maybe things like geology or cultural resources. It may not matter what the water quantity or quality is for those resources, but for many resources, that's important. So again, we want to document that. So next slide, please, Angie. And let me advance to where I could not get my PowerPoint to give me present review this morning, so Angie's doing me the favor. So this is the quote from the preamble to the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, Section 1B, that basically tells us why rivers are designated into the national system. So this is where we first hear about outstandingly remarkable resources that have to be protected and enhanced according to Section 10A. So if you already have a designated river, you can assume that it's free flowing and that it has at least 1 ORV. You only need 1 ORV to make a river eligible for wild and scenic. Next slide, please. So again, a single ORV for the entire river is all that is needed for a river to be eligible. Often we have more than one, but there's not a need to have more ORVs. More ORVs doesn't make the river more worthy of protection. And next slide, please. And I wanted to give you some context for why it's so important to know what ORVs are when you're trying to protect the Scenic River. So, not only are ORVs among the resources that the National Wild and Scenic River System was created to protect, but explicitly Section 10A of the Act tells us that we have to protect and enhance these ORVs. And the baseline is the condition they were in on the date of designation. So we're going to try to at least protect them to that level of quality and, if possible, enhance them. And one element in the Act protects any designated river from federal water resource projects that would directly and adversely affect ORVs, and that includes basically any work in the bed and banks of the river. We usually use the Section 404 of the Clean Water Act as kind of the indicator that we've got a project going on. And it also protects rivers from FERC licensed hydro projects. In addition, not on this slide, there's a section of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act that says if you're a federal land managing agency and you're making a decision about whether to allow an easement or a right-of-way within the designated river corridor, you may grant such an easement or right-of-way, but if you do, you have to include conditions that protect wild and scenic values. So you have to condition that easement or right-of-way. And if you don't know what your ORVs are, obviously you can't do that. And finally, when rivers are designated, they come with a federal reserve water right, which is mainly significant in the prior appropriation states, which also happen to be the driest states. And that water right is in the quantity, the minimum needed to protect the river. So again, any flow dependent ORVs, and it's dated to the date of designation. So next slide, please. Again, the question about river related is often the hardest one to tease out. If you ask yourself, would this resource exist but for the river, that helps a little bit. For example, in wildlife, just because a critter drinks from the river upon occasion does not necessarily mean that it's really dependent on the river or its immediate shorelands for significant life stages. You don't have to do this all by yourself. Ideally, we form interdisciplinary teams to work to identify ORVs. And if you're doing a 5D1 inventory, you already have a planning team. We try to include as many appropriate resource specialties as possible on these teams. And we can also include not just, if you're a federal agency, not just your federal resource folks, but people who are expert who work or are volunteers in other areas, including state agencies, academics from universities, tribal governments, and even local clubs like, birding or botany clubs. An important aspect to know if you're a federal agency is that merely identifying ORVs is not a decision that triggers NEPA. We're just describing what is. We're not making a decision about how to protect those ORVs. That's something that would be done through a planning process that does trigger NEPA. So try not to get into the weeds if you're doing this on how you're going to protect these ORVs. Just keep your focus on whether or not a given resource is an ORV. Next slide, please. So the first step in the process of doing ORV identification or refinement is to compile a list of potential ORVs. So ideally, your planning team would get together and do this And I know in the Park Service, maybe to a certain extent in all federal agencies, there's often a real strong desire among staff to use the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act to try to protect all possible resources they can. And we've had some interesting conversations about this over the years. At Yosemite, when they were doing ORV identification for the Merced River, which was designated without any kind of study, Congress just designated it, so we had to ID the ORVs afterwards. One of the things that was important to a lot of staff at Yosemite was air quality, because if you have poor air quality, you can't really see the spectacular scenery in the Yosemite Valley. But after playing around with it for a while, we did have to decide really air quality is not river dependent or river related. And just because, keep in mind, just because you're not using the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act to protect a resource doesn't mean that you as a federal agency at least don't have other tools to protect that. So you do have to be a little bit ruthless sometimes about what is and is not an ORV. And Monica will be getting into much more detail on some of these examples later. Next slide, please. So again, unique, it's the only one of its kind within a region. And Monica will be helping us talk about regions, but think about it, I'm the only Cassie who lives in my house. So if we decided that the region of comparison was my house, I am unique. But that's maybe too small a region of comparison for a meaningful ORV process. So you want to pick a region that's a little bit bigger than just the river watershed itself, but maybe not the entire world. Although in some cases, maybe you have a resource that is the only one in the world. Rare is pretty self-explanatory. Exemplary is a little bit harder to get your head around sometimes, but here in Alaska, we use it a lot. As you biologists in the audience might know, as you head out from the tropics to the poles, you get lower species diversity and higher species population, which is just shorthand to say that, say, compared to Hawaii, Alaska just does not have that many listed species, fish, plants, animals. But we do have some very exemplary populations of those species. And an example in Alaska might be our 5 species of Pacific salmon. So you might have a lot of rivers here that have salmon. So you can't really say the fact a given river has salmon is unique or rare, but you might have an exemplary population of salmon, or maybe you have all 5 species, and that might make that river exemplary for salmon. So next slide, please. Again, just thinking about picking a good region of comparison, it's more than just local, but probably not national or international unless that's what the IDT thinks is appropriate. And it's very important as you're having the discussion to identify the region of comparison. And by the way, it can vary from one ORV resource to another. To document why the team picked a certain region of comparison. Next slide, please. So when I talk about the process of ORV identification, we often do this through some sort of workshop where the interdisciplinary team gets together for a few days and works through all of these decisions. But sometimes you can't always get all the resource specialists that you'd like to be at the workshop because it's hard to amass that many people at the same time in the same place. So one of the things the Park Service did when we went through this process for all our designated rivers starting in about 2010 was to prepare resource assessment summaries for each resource that we thought could turn out to be an ORV. And these resource assessment summaries can be created, written up by people who can't make the workshop, but then they become the starting point for the workshop. So again, you would just document what you know about any given resource that is under consideration, whether it has any special listing under the Endangered Species Act or maybe on the National Register for cultural resources. And of course, information will never be perfect. And a lot of scientists have a very hard time saying anything if they think there's more work that needs to be done. So it is important to write down what you do know, though, and not be stymied by perfection being the enemy of the good. Next slide, please. So again, these are sources to get some idea about the significance of candidate resources. And if someone's already put this resource on the endangered species list or the National Register or written it up as something really great, you can use that. But in many cases, the interdisciplinary team will have to use its own professional judgment. And that is really something that we are allowed to do. You do not have to defer to outside expertise. The IDT is basically empowered with the ability to make an objective decision. And the only important thing there is to write up what its rationale is. Next slide, please. So I touched a little bit on this before, that where we have relatively few endangered species in Alaska, river-related fish and wildlife here in Alaska for the 25 wild and scenic rivers we have tend to be exemplary rather than unique or rare. But in other regions and for other kinds of resources, you may find this kind of rating rationale useful, where you give each candidate resource a rating based on just how significant it is within your region. You don't have to use this approach, but some groups find it helpful. Next slide, please. And you can also, for a specific resource, for instance, recreation, use rating approaches like this. If you have a whitewater river, for example, some are only runnable for a month or two in the year during the spring or when there are flow releases. Others might be runnable year round. So you can use this approach, but again, and the recreation planners in the audience will say, hey, quantity is not always quality. So let's not forget that even though this particular whitewater run only exists for 5 weekends a year, it draws people from all over the country to come to it. So you have to kind of deal with those balancings of abundance versus how unique or rare the opportunity is. Next slide, please. And you're going to hear this over and over again this morning or this afternoon for you East Coasters and Midwesterners. It's really, really important to document your rationale and decisions for each value. Often the group that identifies ORVs, 10 years later, those people have gone on to do other things, and you can't recreate the exact interdisciplinary team. So it's really important that for the people who might be applying this information, you document how you got to the decision that you made. You want to make sure that your evaluation process and the findings are replicable and defensible. And it doesn't have to be perfect. There's always room for debate, but the people who are on the interdisciplinary team are the ones who get to decide. So at this point, I think we're going to break for some questions before you get to hear from Monica on a lot more detail about specific candidate resource values.
Thanks, Cassie. And yeah, so if anyone has any questions, you can put those in the question box and we'll read them out. But as of right now, I don't see any.
Yeah, I haven't seen any quite yet.
Well, then I think I'm going to, oh, never mind, we just got one in. So Catherine Bear asked, can you give some examples of cultural values that are in use?
I could try to answer that, or we could maybe wait and hear Monica when she gets into a little bit more detail on that.
Yeah, I think Monica will be covering that. So,
I'm going to just send this, Reese, I'm going to send a question back to KB. When you say in use, you're talking about a cultural value that continues to this day as opposed to something that was in existence a couple hundred years ago. Is that what you mean? Okay, we'll have her respond.
And I can just quickly put in an aside, here in Alaska, we have found that subsistence uses of our wild and scenic rivers in many cases is a value that's currently happening. It is, it's not recreational hunting and fishing, it's subsistence use, which is really a cultural value for rural Alaskans and especially tribes. So that might be an example here, and there are probably examples like that in the lower 48 as well.
If we have a second, do you want to do a couple of questions? Because KB said just an example of rivers with those values and what they are specifically.
With those values, you mean a current day cultural use?
I think so.
Okay, well, with the Fish and Wildlife Service, we just in the past year and a half went through this process for all 7 rivers up here in Alaska that were designated in 1980 by ANILCA, and that we didn't really have very robust ORVs associated with. And just an aside, part of that is because until the mid-90s, there wasn't necessarily a consistent method for identifying ORVs that was used by all of the river administering agencies. And an approach like that coalesced in the Pacific Northwest. And when the Interagency Wild and Scenic Coordinating Council was founded in 1995, we took that approach and wrote it up. Jackie Dietrich and I wrote it up in a 1999 paper. It's the study paper, if you're ever looking for it at the council site, which is rivers.gov. And that's when we tried to lay out this approach so that it could be used consistently. So anyway, getting back to the Fish and Wildlife Service rivers in Alaska. Off the top of my head, I don't know if I can remember exactly which ones have subsistence value as an ORV, but I'm pretty sure the Nowitna and the Selawik at least do. These are rivers that have rural settlements that are off-road here in Alaska. A lot of food that people eat, it's really expensive to buy food that has to be flown in. So for cultural reasons and practical reasons, people who live in these rural areas and have always lived on these rivers that ended up getting designated in 1980 have been using and will continue to use river-related resources and areas for subsistence, and things like fish camps, where seasonally every year a tribal or a local village will not completely empty out, but a lot of its residents will go to a specific spot on a given river to harvest fish that will then be dried or canned for use for the coming year. So that's not recreational, it's not sport fishing, it's not trophy hunting, but it is a river-related value that is in many cases exemplary, or in some cases rare, that we have found to be an eligible value. that's ongoing. We're not talking about an archaeological site. We're talking about an activity and, sites like fish camps that happen to be good places to catch fish that have been used for a long time but are still being used. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. We have two more. Tell me if we start getting short on time. But we have, how unusual is it to have geology and paleontology as ORVs that are they're exposed because of the river? That's from Gordon.
Do you want me to answer that or Monica? I've been doing all the talking.
You can go ahead, Cassie. We're going to get into it a little bit more, but it
Oh.
is.
Okay,
Go
yeah,
ahead.
those are good questions. And geology is one of those ORVs that I have seen IDTs struggle with. Some IDTs get very conservative about the river-related part of ORV eligibility. So, if a geologic resource, a feature is not really river dependent, they don't want to include it and things like that. It's debatable, but are volcanoes river dependent? Maybe you can see them from the river and maybe that's kind of interesting, but maybe that makes it more part of a scenic or recreational value rather than geology being the ORV per se. But the issue of the river's erosive processes exposing a geologic feature, I think that's a little bit more valid to say, yeah, this is a river-related resource, but for the river, you would not see these layers. And at Zion National Park, geology is a river-related resource because if anyone's been down there, you know that the canyon and its incredible features were really created by the action of water on some fairly soft rock. So it isn't uncommon for exposed geologic features to be found to be ORVs. Paleontological resources, same thing. You might not know that there were a whole bunch of buried dinosaurs along the Niobrara Wild and Scenic River in Alaska, but for the river eroding those areas and exposing the animal bones. So that can also be a geologic ORV.
Thank you. One more. What about rare herps in ephemeral ponds? Such ponds could theoretically exist without the river. That's from Clark.
Yeah, and that's a good question. I mean, often these ephemeral ponds are in wetland areas rather than, perched high in upland hills. So I think it may depend on whether those ephemeral ponds would exist, but for the river, are they part of the floodplain? So even if they're not persistent bodies of water, they may be hydrologically linked to the river by high annual groundwater. And if you don't have anywhere for these species to develop each spring, if the river wasn't there, then I think you could argue that they're river dependent species.
Okay, thanks. Those are the questions that we have in.
Great. Well, I'll continue on. Angie, can you see my screen okay?
Yep, it looks great.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so these first few slides are a little bit of a summary of what Cassie has already talked about, and also a little bit more kind of cover some of the questions that were just brought up. But essentially, as Cassie mentioned, ORVs must be river related, located in the river or immediate shorelines, unique, rare, or exemplary, and regionally significant, which we're going to get into a little bit more. But essentially, the determination that a river area contains ORVs is a professional judgment. As Cassie mentioned, we want to pull together a interdisciplinary team or an ID team, and they go through the criteria, and it's based on their objective analysis. And it is just an inventory of those resources that are found along a river. So just to expand a little bit more on the aspect that ORVs must be river related. So you can see here the photo on your left designated, so an ORV could be the fisheries, and that is clearly a river related ORV. And this kind of builds off your question about ponds and hydrologic features. But in this example, this is a wetland complex that is dependent on springs in Colorado. And because the complex, and it's a unique complex and it's dependent on springs, it's not river related, even though it's close to a river. So it might take a lot of digging to really look at these values and determine whether or not the value is truly dependent on the river. So it is key that we really look closely and determine if the ORV is river related. The ORV must be located in the river or its immediate shorelines. So essentially it must owe their location and existence to the presence of the river. So that's another important thing to consider. And then Cassie brought up these terms, but ORVs must have the characteristics of one of these, of unique, rare, or exemplary within a region of comparison. And we're going to dive into the region of comparison, but in this photo on the right-hand side, this is the Rogue River. And the office that did the analysis, they identified their region of comparison as Western Oregon from the California border to Washington state border. And this is where the Rogue River flows into a lava tube, which for Western Oregon is something that's unique in that region. So that's just the start as we diving into the region of comparison. So when we look at ORVs, we should assess them on river-related values that must be unique, rare, or exemplary at a comparative region of national scale. So basically, we want to compare values of the river that you're inventorying to other rivers in the region. So we want to establish an area of comparison. And so how do you determine what your region of comparison is going to be? It could be, you can identify your region as hydrologic or a physiographic region. I think the biggest thing to point out is if you're doing an inventory for an eligibility study, or if you're going back and documenting your ORVs for your plan, you want to establish up front what you're going to use for your region of comparison and have that identified so that you're consistent as you're going through your ORVs. And then you also want to document related to your ORVs, the region of comparison that you utilize. So this is just an example of a region of comparison related to physiographic regions or provinces. And so these are the different provinces that are identified for the Western United States. And essentially, these physiographic province is a geographic region in which climate as well as geology have given rise to an array of different landforms that are different than the surrounding regions. And so just to help illustrate this a little bit more for you, I'm going to give you some examples of 3 different physiographic regions. So I'm going to look at the Pacific border, the Columbia Plateau, and the Colorado Plateau. So the first one to give you an example of is the Colorado Plateau. And this is essentially the Four Corners region of Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. And it makes up, this province or region makes up about 130,000 square miles. And the Colorado Plateau is largely made up of high desert, as well as some scattered areas of forest. But essentially, this is the area that's nicknamed the Red Rock Country because of its the red colored rocks. But some of the geologic features that are associated with this physiographic region are hoodoos or reefs, slot canyons, narrows, natural bridges, but along with some of the scattered forests that exist in the Colorado Plateau. The next example of a region of comparison is the Columbia Plateau. And this is eastern Washington and Oregon, as well as the Snake River Plain of Idaho. And this region is uniformly covered with basaltic lava flows. And so there's, because of those lava flows, there's significant warping and faulting, which has caused great range in elevation changes. So there could be a range of 200 feet above sea level, all the way up to 5,000 feet above sea level. And the climate is semi-arid in this region, so it's mostly shrubs and grasses within this region. So some rivers in this region, the Chutes and the Bruno River. This region essentially drains the Columbia and Snake Rivers, drain within this region. And then the last example, just to give you some illustrations, is the Pacific border region. And this essentially encompasses the North American west coastline. And this region is prone to earthquakes along the Pacific Ocean. And essentially it, excuse me, it's the region with one of the most geologically young and tectonically active in North America. And so this is an area where there's generally rugged mountainous landscape. And so we have elevation changes all the way from 500 feet above sea level to 11,500 feet above sea level. So we have, this is also the region that has volcanoes, and it goes from the Pacific border to the Sierra Nevadas. And it is a province that includes along its eastern margin lowlands, but then there's also the steep mountains and coastlines along the west. So just some examples of rivers within this region. So hopefully that helped give you an idea of what we meant by region of comparison. You don't have to use physiographic regions for your region of comparison. So it's just an example of what you could use. You as an ID team, as a member of the ID team, could decide to use something else as your region of comparison. But I think the most important thing here is that it's identified up front what your region of comparison is, as well as documented. Okay, so once you've identified your region of comparison, then your team is going to start looking at the outstandingly remarkable values. And these are the values that Cassie mentioned. They're spelled out in the Wild and Scenic River Act. These are the values that we are responsible for evaluating. And as Cassie mentioned, you only have to have one ORV, but you could have multiple. This webinar, we're briefly going to go into the different criteria for these ORVs, but I just want to identify for you that it's important for you to look for other resources on the criteria. So the Interagency Wild and Scenic River Council has developed a technical paper, a white paper, that lines out the criteria. I believe it's in the study process white paper that's found on the rivers.gov website that spells out the criteria that you would go over, and it's an objective analysis by your ID team to review and determine whether or not your river contains any of these ORVs based on the criteria. But I also encourage you to look at your specific agency policy because in many cases there's additional policy guidance related to the criteria related to the ORVs that you need to utilize when you're going through the analysis. So now we're going to dive into the different ORVs. So the first one that we're going to look at is the Scenic ORV, and this essentially is looking at a landscape for the elements of landform, vegetation, water, and color. And essentially with Scenic, just because a river is pretty doesn't necessarily mean that it meets the criteria of an ORV. And once again, this is a spot where the different agency policy guides additional detailed description of the criteria for the Scenic ORV. So within BLM, our guidance identifies that we utilize BLM's visual resource management guidance, so our inventory handbook for BRM. Within the Park Service, they have the Enjoy the View, which working with Hector Santiago in the St. Croix area, they have taken a lot of BLM's visual resource management guidance and have developed Enjoy the View and their specific visual resource inventory, river specific descriptions and scenic quality and criteria that they need to get, that the Park Service needs to go through to help identify the scenic values and whether or not a river corridor meets the criteria. And so it's important that you look at your specific agency policy related to the criteria of Scenic. One thing to point out too with Scenic, and Cassie started to mention this a little bit, but we have to remember that the scenery must be river related. So even though you may have some mountains in the background that are really beautiful, you have to ask yourself, are those river related to the particular river that you're evaluating? And if not, you're not going to have it as one of your ORVs. But for example, in the middle photo of the Virgin River, you have those canyon walls with the contrasting color, and those canyon walls are carved by the river. And so you can truly see that scenery that's created is really dependent on the river being related to the river. Okay, so the next ORV that we look at is recreation. So specifically, we want to look at the recreational opportunities within the river corridor, and do they have the potential to attract visitors throughout or beyond the region, or is it even, does this area attract national attention? And for a recreation ORV, once again, it has to be river related. So it's boating, fishing, camping, so river related recreation opportunity. One thing to think about when you're going through this analysis is you may determine as an ID team that fishing is a outstanding remarkable value for the river because of the draw that the public comes for the recreation opportunities to fish on a particular river. But at the same time, you may not, through your analysis, determine fisheries as an outstanding remarkable value. So just to let you know, just because you have fishing as a recreation opportunity doesn't necessarily mean that you have fish as one of your fisheries as one of your ORVs. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, geologic. So there's already been a couple questions about geologic, and Cassie started to allude to this, especially in her answer related to the Virgin River, the Narrows area. So the biggest thing with geologic ORV, it must be a result of the hydrologic processes associated with the river. So for example, the hydrologic downcutting or sediment deposition, Cassie was describing the Virgin River. And so the photo on the left, this is the Virgin River in Zion National Park. And essentially it contains exceptionally deep and narrow slot canyons that were created by the accelerated rates of erosion through sandstone formation. So the Virgin River cut through this sandstone, and it created these unique slot canyons and this unique geologic feature. Another example of a geologic ORV would be on your right, and this is the Owyhee River. And essentially the geologic feature here is ongoing weathering and erosion along the Owyhee River. Has carved the rock formations along the meandering course. And so there's individual spires or pinnacles known as hoodoos, and those were created by the river. So that geology feature is related to the hydrologic features of the river that flows through the Owyhee Canyon. So I think that's the biggest thing to remember with geology. geologic ORV, as it needs to have be a result of the hydrologic process associated with the river. Okay, so then the next ORV is fish habitat as well as population. And I'm going to try a little video. Can you see this, Angie?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so with that little video, it showed the ORV for fish population as well as fish habitat. So what we need to look at here is we want to look at the specific fish population, and that fish population must be nationally or regionally important. So an indigenous resident species, and the species must be of wild stock, or it could be federal or state listed, such as a candidate, threatened, endangered, or sensitive species. And so, and also the diversity of species is also an important consideration. So on this river in Oregon, the ORV was identified, the fish population was identified as one of the ORVs because of the significance and the importance of this indigenous fish species. At the same time, you want to look at the fish habitat as well and determine whether or not the fish habitat is an ORV. And so when you look at the habitat, the river should provide exceptionally high quality habitat for fish species indigenous to the region of comparison. And so, excuse me, so with this ORV, you can look at the population as well as the habitat and determine and document whether or not it possesses the criteria for that particular ORV. And just like the diversity of species, the diversity of habitat is also important in the consideration when you are determining whether or not the fish habitat is an outstanding remarkable value. Okay, so now the next ORV is wildlife population. So similar to fish, the wildlife population of the river or area within the river corridor contains nationally or regionally important population of indigenous wildlife species. So these species are dependent on the specific river corridor, so they are river related. And similar to fish, the species are considered to be unique to the area, and or they are populations of federal or state listed candidate, threatened, endangered, sensitive species. And so you could also have a diversity of species with your wildlife population as well. Similar to fisheries, you also can identify the habitat as an ORV. And so once again, the habitat provides exceptionally high quality habitat for wildlife of nationally or regionally significance. And so in this photo example, this is one of the largest intact cottonwood riparian forests left in the western United States. And so there's a great diversity of habitat, and it helps support a bald eagle population. So bald eagles were once listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, as well as this habitat supports the yellow-billed cuckoo, which is listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And so you can also look at the habitat for wildlife. Okay, so the next ORV is historic, and so this is essentially an ORV that has scientific value for buildings or structures that are associated with an event, person, or distinctive style. So these are areas where likely candidates are sites that are eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, or at the national level, or they could be designated as a National Historic Landmark by the Secretary of Interior. So these are those historic features that are found along the river corridor. And we started to talk about this a little bit earlier, and Cassie was doing a great job of helping to explain the cultural ORV, especially in the lower photo with the subsistence fishing and the tribes that depend on the river for their subsistence living. And so specifically, it contains rare, outstanding examples of historic or prehistoric locations of human activity. It can also be an importance for traditional cultural or religious importance. And so there could be features on a river corridor that has significant religious importance to a traditional culture. And so that might be a reason to identify cultural as an ORV. And then there is kind of the catch-all, so other similar values. There's not specific criteria in the agency manuals, so but it could be, Cassie was mentioning the paleontological resources, it could be hydrological. So those resources that are river related, as Cassie gave the example of the bones that were found on the river, and they were in the sediment along the river, and they're related to that river, and it is of regional significance. So it could be of high importance. Okay, so already got to wrapping up the ORVs and the region of significance. Before we switch it back to Cassie, are there any additional questions?
Yeah, we have a couple of questions. Linda asks, so is it more likely to find your comparison river in the same physiographic region?
Could you read that again?
Yeah, I'm word for word. So is it more likely to find your comparison river in the same physiographic region?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the way I'm understanding is when you're looking at ORVs, you want to compare similar rivers within your region. So you wouldn't want to compare a river that's found in the Colorado Plateau to a river that's found along the Pacific border. You want to compare your ORVs to a river that's within the same region, because you have to identify whether it's unique, rare, or exemplary to your region. So you want to compare apples to apples, I guess is the best way to describe that.
Yeah, Linda, let us know if that answered your question. And then another one from Gordon. Does fish and wildlife include plants?
Well, it does when you look at the habitat. So there is potential when you're looking at plants, how that relates to the habitat. Or plants may be one of those other values depending on what exactly it is and whether or not the either fish or wildlife depends on that plant.
And if I can just jump in to elaborate on that, I know we have at least one river, the Obed in Tennessee, has an ORV, botanical resource that's an ORV. It's basically a plant that grows in river scoured gravels that is totally dependent on the river to exist. So botanical is one of those possible other resources that can be considered to be an outstandingly remarkable value if, of course, it's river dependent.
Okay, Linda said you answered her question. I have a question, you guys. What about when you sometimes see as an ORV water quality as a specifically called out ORV? How does that happen when it's supposed to be one of the free flowing and water quality are sort of assumed? When does that happen?
I haven't, at least what I've looked at, I haven't seen it specifically called as an ORV because it's identified as one of the other river values.
The only time I can't remember the rivers. The only time I remember seeing it was when the water quality was particularly outstanding, and unusually wonderful for some reason. There's at least one in Oregon. Okay, thanks.
I have seen, Risa, we have had rivers where the team decided that hydrology or hydrological processes were outstandingly remarkable. So you wouldn't want to just say water quality because, as you point out, that's a boilerplate value. And just a sidestep for a minute, when we were working on these assessments for the National Park Service, we used the terminology wild and scenic river values for the 3 different categories of things that the Act explicitly protects: free-flowing character, water quality, and then the specific ORVs, one or more ORVs for a given designated river. So those 3 categories of values are wild and scenic values. But when we just talk about ORVs, we're not usually talking about water quality and free flow. So, we do have hydrology or hydrological processes identified as a specific ORV on some rivers where there's something about the river's hydrological conditions that are outstanding, unique, rare, or exemplary. But we would never just say water quality per se, because that is supposed to be protected already.
Okay, thanks. One more question from Linda. Is it more challenging to document recreational ORVs? ? Are they mostly about boating or fishing?
I guess I wouldn't. I guess I wouldn't say it depends. So I mean, there are some areas where the recreation opportunity is just nationally or regionally known, and so it may be pretty easy to identify recreation or that recreation opportunity as an ORV. But there may be some other cases where it may not be something that's of importance, and you wouldn't even identify it as an ORV. So I guess it really goes back to your region of comparison. So how does it relate to the other rivers within your region, and really what is it, and how significant is it? Is it, and going back to the terms of unique, rare, and exemplary.
Yeah, and I do know on one or more rivers, we have identified a river trail, a trail that basically parallels the river as being river dependent. And you can sort of think of that in contrast to, say, some of our national long distance trails like the Pacific Crest or Appalachian trails that inevitably have to cross rivers but may not really be a form of river dependent recreation. We do have some areas where maybe there isn't a lot of water in the river, so it's not really boatable, but there is nonetheless a riverfront trail that is a recreational ORV. So it doesn't have to be in the river in order to be in that category of recreation.
Those are the questions that are in so far. Thanks.
Okay, so continuing on, we're almost done. Just to reiterate what we've told you many times so far, ORVs really need to be river related. And what we see happen in interdisciplinary teams is that sometimes they start the process being pretty ruthless and specific about that river related, river dependent criterion. But then later in the discussion, without realizing what they're doing, they circle back and start considering resources that haven't made it through that filter yet. So sometimes it's useful to put these criteria up on the wall so that as conversations bog down around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, one of the team members can point up at the criteria and say, you know what, we're beating a dead horse here. This resource didn't make it through the river related need, so we should stop talking about it. Then, a little bit more of a subjective determination if you don't have a resource value that is, say, on a national register or on the endangered species lists. It's up to the resource specialists on the interdisciplinary team to decide if the resource in question is unique, rare, or exemplary, and also to define the region. And something we maybe didn't say strongly enough is that you don't have to use the same region of comparison for each and every candidate resource value. You can have different regions for different kinds of values. So the physiographic regions that Monica was giving us the deep dive into are often quite relevant for biophysical resources. But for things like recreation or cultural resources, you might use a different region. So for recreation, you might consider the area from which recreational visitors are drawn. And that might be different from a physiographic region. And in some cases, it might be national or even international. We have some rivers here in Alaska that are very popular for backcountry expeditions by folks from Europe. They come all the way from Europe to float some of our Brooks Range rivers. And so you could consider the region of comparison for that recreational value to be international. And likewise for cultural values, we often look at the area occupied by the culture that we're considering. So that could also differ from a physiographic region, or it might be the same. But you can pretty much have your resource specialist for that particular resource help you decide which region makes sense for that specific resource. And then again, not to beat a dead horse, but the rationale for why a value qualifies really has to be written down. It can be exhausting to go through these processes, and the last thing you feel like doing is having to write it all down and fuss over the exact wording. It doesn't have to be pretty, but it really is necessary to try to record it for posterity. So next slide, please, Angie. This is the flow chart that we looked at in a more simple format at the beginning of the slideshow. We're going to go through the decision tree again. And by the way, there are footnotes. You might be able to see the little footnote symbols on some of these blue questions. And so there's a narrative that goes with this that goes into a little bit more detail about each question's context. So we start with asking, is this candidate resource even present either within the river or within its corridor? And if the answer is no, you can just stop then. And you would want to document it, but you don't have to give further consideration to that particular resource. If the answer is yes, then you move on to the next question, and that's the river-related or dependent question. And again, if the answer is no, you can end there, but you do want to explain why the team found that it was not river dependent, because often this is something where there's a little bit of debate about, so you want to make sure the rationale you used is recorded. If the answer is yes, this is when we go on to deciding whether this resource, this river-related resource, could be outstandingly remarkable, i.e. unique, rare, or exemplary. So at this point, you need to pick your region of comparison and decide if this resource fits into one of those three categories of special significance. And so you decide whether that's true or not. If it's a river-related resource, but it just is kind of common and doesn't make the unique, rare, or exemplary cut, then it's not an ORV and you document that. If it does make the cut, you then have to remember to record whether it was unique, rare, or exemplary, as well as describing the region that you used, which you should also describe even if the answer is no. And for the purposes of a river inventory, a 5D1 inventory, such as are more commonly done by BLM and the Forest Service than by the Park Service or Fish and Wildlife Service, although to give them credit, the Fish and Wildlife Service did do a great inventory for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge here in Alaska back in 2011 and came up with candidate rivers that were eligible. Usually when you're doing a river inventory, not working on a designated river, you may not decide that it's necessary to also talk about whether the ORV is flow or water quality dependent. Remember that if an inventoried river is found to be eligible or eligible and suitable, you don't have the tools in the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act that only apply to either designated rivers or congressional study rivers. You don't have those tools to protect those values, but you're still required to protect them using your other agency authorities. But if the ORV is for a designated river and or a congressional study river, it is important to then document whether it's flow or water quality dependent, because you want to make sure that you have the flow and the water quality needed to sustain the ORV. And for a river that's a study river, a congressional study river, this might inform your suitability determination, which is the next step in the study. In other words, if you had an ORV that was flow dependent, but there was no way to protect the flows in the future, even if the river was designated by Congress, if it turned out the water use authorities or the state had other plans for the flows in that river and those entities were not committed to protecting the flows needed to sustain the ORV, if your one and only ORV that made a study river eligible for designation could not be protected in the long run, it would fail the suitability determination. So it can be really important to look at that flow and water quality linkage for congressional study rivers. And obviously for designated rivers, you want to know this information because your mission, you are required to protect those flows and water quality to the best of your abilities. So if the resource is not flow or water quality dependent, that's easy. You just say that it isn't. But if it is, then you want to document what kinds of flows, the whole duration, timing, actual amounts, and so on that a hydrologist would help you with, and or the water quality that is needed to maintain and if possible, enhance this resource. So this is where you get into a lot of detail, but it can be very useful to have that information. If, for example, there's a decision by the agency to apply through the state system for an in-stream flow rate, or even less usual, but it could happen if there's an actual adjudication of flows for that river where you're going to be working to assert your Federal Reserve water rate. So I think that is it. Again, you want to document your findings. This is not the funnest part of the whole workshop, but it's the product that you're creating, and without documentation, you might as well not have had the workshop. I guess we just want to talk a little bit about examples of a a good description and a poor description. Okay, this is animated in the EPLI module that we've been referring to, that you can self-study yourself, but I'm just going to read it today. A poor description of an ORV, excuse me, my phone is going off. A poor description of an ORV would be something like, whitewater boating is exceptional for this river reach. And that just doesn't tell you enough about what makes whitewater boating exceptional for you to have any idea, say if you're writing a management plan, how to protect that ORV. Here's an example that is from Zion, the Virgin River in Zion, which has also got portions administered by the BLM outside the national park, that we do consider to be a good description. Exceptional opportunities exist along the Virgin River, providing visitors from around the world a chance to develop personal and lasting connections with the river within some of the most unique water-carved desert canyons in the region. So again, there's other water-carved desert canyons, but these are unique. And also there's more visitors here. The dramatic setting dominated by scenic grandeur contributes to a spectrum of river-related uses and experiences, from self-reliant uses and experiences, from the self-reliant adventure of canyoneering or hiking and backpacking through the narrow river and creek channels, to enjoying photography and other artistic pursuits, to viewing scenery or camping, to opportunities to experience serenity, solitude, and general enjoyment along the river corridor. For generations, the striking contrast of heat and water, stone and gardens have drawn people to this unique desert river and its tributaries. And then the region of comparison for the recreational outstandingly remarkable value is the portion of the Colorado Plateau that lies in southwestern Utah. So that's a lot longer, but it really does put a lot more meat on the bones of the ORV. And if you were going to be developing a river management plan, you would have some idea what recreational opportunities and experiences you're supposed to protect. And if you didn't even have a plan yet, but you had a proposed water resources project or a proposed easement or right-of-way that you had to make a decision about, you would be able to go through the environmental analysis for those proposed projects and decide based on, you know, some real, some specific resources and impacts, whether or not your project could proceed on a designated river. So finally, the next slide, you do want to retain your analysis, your interdisciplinary team write-up as part of the record. If you're doing an inventory, this is an essential part of the inventory for the planning decision. You would summarize the findings that the team made in the Federal Register notice, such as, you know, the BLM region has just prepared a resource management plan. I think I'm using the right terminology, but Monica, correct me if I'm wrong. And it was found that name the rivers were eligible for wild and scenic, and name the other rivers were not eligible because they didn't have any ORVs. Any stream segments that aren't found to be eligible are released from any further protection. But those that are eligible, they're not necessarily protected by the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act unless they're part of a congressional river study, but the agency is nonetheless required to try to protect them unless and until they're found to be non-suitable. And I think that's it. So we're open to some more questions as we wind down the rest of the hour or the 90 minutes.
And we have a question. Here's a great question. If a federally proposed fish barrier would require the downgrading of rec status to scenic, recreational status to scenic, is that prohibited by the Wild Scenic Rivers Act? Meaning, does that count as adversely affecting the ORV of the recreation? And Julie's asking about a river that is not yet designated.
Okay, I'm trying to get my mind around this answer for if it was a designated river. So that this is actually more of a management question rather than an ORV question, because what I hear Julie saying is that this is a river that is classified as wild, I guess, if she's saying it would be downgraded to scenic. So keep in mind, and this can be really confusing. There are 3 possible classifications for wild and scenic rivers: wild, scenic, and recreational. Confusingly, you may not have a recreational ORV on a segment that is classified recreational, and you might not have scenery as an ORV on a segment that's classified scenic. That's just the nomenclature that Congress used in the act. And some of us kind of wish they'd used classification 1, 2, 3, or ABC, but they didn't, and it's too late now. So if we're talking about a project that would not normally be allowed in a wild segment because they're supposed to be essentially undeveloped vestiges of primitive America, to quote from the act. And you had a proposed fish weir, which, by the way, anytime you're constructing something in the better banks of a river, you are triggering Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. And the act says no federal agency may issue a permit that would have a direct and adverse effect on the river. So in theory, if this fish weir would be significant enough an impact to render that river segment no longer wild, but change its character to scenic, the river managing agency should tell the federal entity, i.e. the Corps of Engineers, that they really should not issue that permit. So that's not so much of an ORV question, that's more of a management question. But if in addition, this weir was going to be adversely impacting an actual ORV, you would want to look at what kind of an impact there'd be and whether it would really be having a direct and adverse impact on that ORV as a part to kind of a de minimis, too small an impact to really matter on the ORV. I hope that answers the question. And if if this is a river that hasn't been designated yet and isn't part of a congressional study, the part of the act that deals with wanting to examine the impacts of water resources projects does not apply. That's Section 7 of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and it only applies to either congressional study rivers or designated rivers, or in the case of a proposed river that a state governor has applied to the Secretary of the Interior for designation of for a limited time, it also applies to that kind of river. But if you're talking about an inventoried river identified by, say, the Forest Service or BLM as being eligible, but it hasn't passed congressional muster yet, unfortunately, Section 7 does not apply to that river.
Thank you, Cassie. We're out of questions.
Yeah, thank you, Cassie and Monica. Just, wonderful presentations today. And in case anyone needs, here's their contact information. Also, this contact information is provided on the handout. And just a couple more things. We've got a lot of events going on with RMS. I also know it's about to be river time, river season. But I did want to just point out we've got our last webinar in this series on June 16th about steps to address user capacities on wild and scenic rivers. So please join us for that. Next week, coming up, we have a River Management Roundtable. You can find out more information on our events section of our website. This is free to folks. And the first in our kind of sub-series of Gearing Up Personally, where we're going to be kind of looking at some of some ways to relate to other people on that we work with and that we meet on the rivers. And then finally, at the beginning of June, we've got a virtual River Ranger rendezvous. It's going to be a full day of some awesome presentations and networking and getting to know other River Rangers. Again, you can find out more information about all of these events on our website in the events section. So thanks again, Cassie and Monica, and thank you to everyone else for joining us. And I hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.